I'm Brian Van, sportbiketrackgear.com, and today we're going to install a rear Galfer wave rotor on our 2015 STG Yamaha YZF-R3. End of the day, this is a pretty simple project. This bike is really new. We've got 800 miles on this motorcycle. A disclaimer here, okay, Galfer, right on the package, it says that the warranty is going to be void without the use of Galfer pads. I don't believe they even have the rear pads for this available yet. The pads that are on there are fine, and quite honestly, rear brakes, you know, that's something you don't really use very often. We're going to be replacing this mainly for its aesthetic benefit. Yes, there are some mild performance benefits to it, but with this bike, honestly, it's gonna make the rear wheel look amazing. It's a really affordable modification. You get higher performance, right, track bikes where you do this. The weight savings will be a more noticeable benefit than what we're gonna have here today with our R3. But due to the fact the bike is so new, there's such low mileage on it, okay, I feel comfortable reusing the pads. And the key is too, when you bed these in, the first about 100 miles on the street, you want to make sure and take your time and really bed the brakes in slowly. The first few applications, right, don't put yourself in a situation where you're going to be panic braking, where you're going to really ask a lot for your brakes. You want to brake them in slowly so you can transfer some friction material from the pad to the rotor, as that's how a lot of the braking power is really generated. So you want that to happen slowly. That's going to really increase the longevity and performance that rotor is going to give you over the long haul. What kind of tools do we need to do this? This is a really, really basic job. There are some instructions included in here. A rear stand to lift the motorcycle up. Some brake cleaner to clean off brake parts, the new brake rotor, some rags. I've got tools to take the rear tire off. I've got tools to change the rear rotor. You assemble all that, you're ready to go. Okay, we're ready to begin. Got my Pitbull rear stand, so I'm going to employ my Pitbull Pit Crew tire wedge. What this does is this actually helps to support the wheel during removal and installation. It just makes the project that much easier. I'm going to put that into position. I've got a 22 millimeter socket on a big 1/2-inch ratchet. Got a 19 millimeter wrench on the other side. Go ahead and break the axle loose. This is a nylock style locking nut. Takes a little effort to get it loose until you get to the very end. Put that to the side and push the axle through. Grab the axle from the other side and pull. When we put this back in today, we will lubricate it a little bit. That will allow it to be removed and installed much easier in the future. Push the wheel forward a little bit. It's going to get some slack in the chain. It's going to allow me to pull it off of the sprocket. Now we're ready to roll the wheel back. Get in here, tilt the wheel, pull the caliper, and slide it to the outside of the swing arm. Be careful so you don't scratch anything here. When you have the wheel off, this is a great time to clean it if it's dirty. Right? When you have it off the bike, everything is very accessible. Get your cleaner, get your polish, clean it up real nice. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clean the surface of that brand new Galfer rotor off. Oftentimes there will be surface protector that is on the disc itself to inhibit any corrosion while it's on the shelves or being transported. So just wipe that off. Notice we're out of shop towels today. We're actually using paper towels now. Okay, now on to the wheel itself. These will typically be fairly tight. I'm using a good quality Allen, right? I've got a snap-on Allen in there and a 3/8 ratchet. From the factory, these are typically Loctited. So expect them to thread out, requiring effort all the way. I'll repeat this process for all 3 of the rotor mounting bolts. Okay, all of the bolts are out. There's our stock disc. Obviously, I'll save this in the spares pile. And here is that Galfer disc. I'm going to install it so the Galfer name is facing outward. I'm going to use just a little bit of blue thread locker on each one of these. This is a spot where if you're a torque wrench user, you're going to want to go ahead and search online the torque spec for the rear rotor bolts. I myself am not, so we will not be using a torque wrench in this video, but that's a personal choice, okay? Because it is important that you have good even torque on each one of these rotor bolts. And make sure to exercise caution when starting these, because remember, we had some thread locker in here, right? And it is definitely in the way a little bit. You can kind of feel it interfering as you begin to thread them in. So make sure you've got everything started nice and that they thread down with relative ease. What I'm going to do is get this down what would basically be finger tight like so and stop. I'll repeat that through all 3. And then I will apply final torque. Okay, back to the first one. Okay, that's good to go. Now I want to come over here. I want to have a look at the rear brakes and the caliper, right? You can clearly see these things are in phenomenal condition right now. There's no real maintenance or service needed. Some things I am going to check, even though it is super low mileage. Let's make sure that the caliper is sliding well on the bracket. No problem there, no restrictions. I'm going to take a little bit of brake cleaner, just kind of hose this off a little bit, right? To ease installation, we'll push the caliper piston back in just a little bit, not a ton, just enough so it slides over the rotor easily the first time. Very light pressure. Like so. Not enough to damage the pad, just a little bit of pressure. Let's go ahead and grab this. We'll allow that to evaporate. Clean up the work table here, and we're ready to put our rear tire on. Remember, like I talked about before, we want to lubricate the rear axle a little bit before we put it back in. So I've got some multi-purpose grease that we will use to do just that. Get your rear wheel, bring it back into position. You'll start on the caliper side. Get the caliper to slide over the rotor like so. Make sure you've got your wheel spacer in place. And your caliper. Gotta make sure it's the groove is riding on the boss there. That is actually part of the swing arm. Now we'll roll the tire forward here on the other side. Let's This will allow us to get our chain back over. We very recently did that 600 mile or 500 mile service on the motorcycle, so the chain tension and everything is already good to go. I will roll the tire back into position, let it sit for a second, and we'll go ahead and get some of this grease. Doesn't take much, just a little bit. Very thin film goes a long way with something like this. Kind of lube the shaft up. Probably gonna get a lot of comments over what I just said there. That's okay, all right. And now we're ready to slide that back through. Get everything lined up. Like so. Come over here. Make sure we're lined up with the caliper bracket. Now we have to push that chain tensioner back into position. Right there. All the way through. Get that axle nut started. And now we'll take the pressure off. Pit bowl tire wedge. I like to take a screwdriver or a wrench. I'm going to wedge it in between the sprocket and the chain like you see right there. What this does, this creates pressure, okay, and it forces the axle forward. I'm going to tap on it a couple of times. We want to make sure that the chain adjusters are forced all the way forward against the swing arm, like so. And now we're ready to snug up the rear axle. Going to get our wrench on there. See, I'm using my arm to actually hold the tire in position so there is still pressure on that screwdriver. Another spot here, if you're a torque wrench user, you're going to want to grab yours and use it. All the torque specs for these bikes are available online. That feels good right there. Get our screwdriver out of there. The tire wedge off. Now, very important step before you take the bike out. Make sure we pump up the rear brake. Check operation. Everything looks and feels good. You got to admit, that looks a lot better, especially with the great detail on that factory Yamaha wheel, the blue color of the wheel, spoke design. That rotor really sets all that off. Bike could use a little cleanup. When you take it out, remember the first few applications very, very light. You want to break this in easily, right? Especially if this is your street bike. You want this to last and perform for a long time. Break it in easy. They recommend being easy on the brakes for somewhere around 100 miles. Honestly, as you ride it, you'll really feel them go from feeling like there's almost no brakes, right? Because that's how they feel the first few applications. If you do both rotors at the same time, you need to make sure that you ride around in a parking lot a little bit at first, or like a subdivision. Give yourself a ton of room. Begin that bed-in process, because they're not very effective at first until you get some of that friction material transferred from the pads to the rotors. I can't stress that enough. Be ready for that, because if you go out and you ask a lot for from the brakes, the first application after you've replaced that rotor, it's going to generate a ton of heat, right? You're squeezing the pads on the rotor and there's not a lot of friction there yet, so you're not getting a lot of performance out of the brakes. So it generates a ton of heat. The heat all goes into that disc. The disc warps, and then you have problems down the road. So you really want to avoid that. Be careful. Break the rotors in with care. This is our Galfer rear rotor install on our 2015 Yamaha YZF-R3.